Welcome to Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville. Join 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer, Mike Miller.
Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Mike's on Mike. It's nice to have you with us. Thank you all. I'm here, of course, with Mike Hightower, once again in studio with us. Our friend Mike Tolbert is back in the stall, still shoveling it. And we're joined today by yet another Mike. This place is going to be Mike-filled. But Dr. Michael Binder is with us from the University of North Florida in the Public Opinion Research Laboratory. And I told him when I saw him, I said, this is the first time we've met in person. I used to have him on my old radio show years ago.
You don't look that old.
He was only 12.
Well, with all the long hair, I don't fit in this group.
He says, I want to be a journalist.
Length of hair is not my issue.
No kidding. Anywhere. But anyhow, Michael has been around. You've been around here how long?
About 2011.
It was 11?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. He's been here since 11. Not only does he head up the political science department at the University of North Florida, he's also the faculty director of UNF's Public Opinion Research Lab, PORL, and also the UNF Faculty Association president and UNF Board of Trustee member. Good to have you with. I'd read the rest of this, but we've got stuff to talk about.
The important part of that is my name is Mike, so I am allowed to be on the show.
You are allowed to be on the show. Exactly right.
We finally have 3 mics in the studio.
Isn't
finally.
That nice?
Finally.
Yeah.
Tolbert, that's a hint.
And one hanger-on.
Yeah.
See you next Tuesday.
Yes, we'll see you next Tuesday for sure.
Promises.
We got a lot to talk about this morning, this afternoon, whenever you're watching this thing, but I want to start out with the newest information, which I saw this morning in the TU, Mike, and that was your comments about yet another removal of another state attorney. Mr. DeSantis is just making his way through every county that's got a Democrat sitting as the state attorney and is just unceremoniously just telling them, you're out of there. This one, by the way, is the one from Orange and Osceola counties, by the way, who, by the way, happens to be the only African-American state attorney in the state of Florida. And this was preceded by Monique Worrell, who was Andrew Warren, who was with Hillsborough County, which, by the way, is where we got NAFCare from, if anybody cares.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
Maybe
working out well.
Isn't it, though? Everything is just fitting into place. It's like a puzzle. Tell us about your comments this morning, though, regarding the removal of these state attorneys.
Well, I think it's always important to understand that, these folks were elected. And yes, it's true that the governor theoretically has this responsibility, but historically it's only been under extreme circumstances where these folks get removed from office. Crimes, indictments, high crimes and misdemeanors, if you will. This being done for political purposes, at least what obviously appear to be political purposes, and preemptively about potentially not enforcing laws down the road, is a very new dynamic, and which is in a lot of ways parallels a lot of things happening in Tallahassee, the threat to local rule and the consolidation of power in the state capital. And that's something, particularly in larger cities that have Democrats in office, you have to really look at skeptically, and it's a big concern.
Does our Constitution address this in saying that the governor has the power to remove elected officials, or does it just not address it, so therefore he's taking on the role without any real legal?
He's got the authority to do so. Again, if the state legislature is on board, and when you have supermajorities in your party, that makes it a lot easier to do. But it was not designed for these circumstances. It was designed for crimes and impeachment type of situations.
Right.
Gosh, there's a parallel between what he's doing and the former mayor who removed all of the JEA members and a couple other offices. Maybe they're cousins or related.
Yeah. However, the difference with that is that those are appointed by the mayor anyhow, so he should obviously can call for them to leave if he wishes to. This is a legally, duly elected official from the people of their respective.
I think if what Mike is saying is he has the authority, is it appropriate?
That's a very different question, and I think the answer is clearly no in both cases.
Yes,
and you've seen that there's a bill that was filed for this upcoming legislative session that it gives the governor the authority to remove elected officials that tear down Confederate monuments, and that is wholly out of left field and not at all in the
Right field.
Well, hold on. That is our local party chair who submitted that bill,
Really?
by the way.
That's right.
Okay.
And that, by the way, that thing is, I don't think it yet has a companion, or it's doesn't have a companion, and I'm not sure it has many signatures at this point.
And I suspect it probably won't pass, but just the fact that it's getting introduced, it tells you a lot about what's happening out there.
Well, it's
Can we get into polling for a minute?
Yep.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
I mean, I think we've got a polling expert at the table. I'd like to talk to him about it for a minute. Tell me what a college polling lab does, and what does a director of a college polling lab do?
Well, we get a little bit of gray hairs, that's for sure. And so I think we do two separate things. One that you guys all see, and your listeners presumably, when we release our public polls, often political in nature, whether they're election related or policy related. But on the backside, the things that you folks don't see is the work that keeps the lights on. Nobody pays for these political polls. We do these out of our own hide, mostly because I'm a political science by trade and I think they're valuable. But what we do on the backside, we do work for state agencies, private entities, all sorts of folks. For example, we do a lot of work for the Florida Department of Transportation. You see those signs, click it or ticket, wear your seatbelts. A lot of federal money associated with that. There's an evaluative component. So we conduct surveys on awareness of those types of things, and that helps pay our bills. Okay. But the political things that you talk about, I think are invaluable, and it gives the regular voters that maybe can't afford a lobbyist the ability to have their voices heard and at least have electeds see where they fit on some of these issues.
Yeah.
Okay. Mike, in the years that you've been the director of the lab, have you seen that the public interest in what you're doing has grown, or it stayed about the same? Well, it seemed to me it's grown.
Well, I think it's varied. I think some of the heat has changed post-2016 and some of the attention we get. But I certainly think there's always been a ton of interest, mostly because people care about politics and they want to know what's going on. And it's very true that all of us live in little bubbles. Some of those bubbles are larger than others, but to see outside your bubble and get a sense of where everybody sits or where specific segments of the society sit, like if you break down a crosstab and look at different parties or different ages or something like that, I think people are fascinated by that and they want to understand better.
Let me go to one of your polls specifically, and one that we've talked about on the show before. We've had Andrew Pantazzi on a couple of times, and the first time he came on was one of the issues that obviously you found out a lot about in your polling. And I think it's one of the most eyebrow-raising polling results in that poll that you took between September 12th and 15th, where 52% of those polled approved the idea of building a new jail away from its present location, while only 6% approved the renovation as presented by the Jaguars, as far as renovating the stadium and developing that entertainment center around it. Was that as surprising to you as it was to at least us?
We were shocked.
I think the surprise comes when you look at the second question when we asked about the stadium polling. And I said, if it meant that the Jaguars leave,
right,
will you pony up that $1 billion? And suddenly that support went up into the mid-40s. And it was a much closer scenario. So with the gun to their head, the voters maybe begrudgingly would acquiesce and maybe kick up some money. But certainly it's not a situation where the city is, and by city, I mean the taxpayers and the voters are exceptionally excited about forking over $1 billion to a multi-billionaire.
And even with that 46% that you talk about, they still had 47% that were in disapproval of the idea of it. So it went up quite a bit, but it was still underwater. You're right, still underwater.
Mike, another aspect of that same poll found that State Attorney Melissa Nelson, let me make sure I have it right, had 31% approval rating. The mayor, which is Mayor Deegan, stood at 47 approval, and the city council had a 39 approval rating. Did any of those results surprise you?
I think that it's important to keep in mind it's not just about approval, particularly for Melissa Nelson. 53% didn't have an answer. They didn't know because they're not plugged in. They don't follow. So they didn't know. So she was well above water. So the fact that so many people didn't know, that 39% suddenly looks much better because she was single digits opposition.
You probably played into the next question from Mike Tolbert, who has wondered about that, Mike, on that.
No, I have wondered about that, Dr. Bender. She's been in office now for a long time. She's run at least twice that I know of. And to be unrecognized by 53% or whatever it was, that seems to me to be very strange.
We're talking now about Melissa Nelson.
Talking about Melissa Nelson.
Right.
And my notion of that, but one of the reasons that's true is because she is underground. She's not doing what I think she should be doing, especially when it comes to some of the shenanigans going on in the city council,
like ethics in government.
So she stays out of the limelight a great deal.
Yeah, no, that's true. She definitely stays out of the limelight, and there's different roles for state's attorneys. People envision that role differently, but she has done some press conferences occasionally if they're rolling out a policy with the sheriff and the mayor, and those people have changed over the years since she's been in office, but she is not out there on the front pages of the TU or on any of the local news stations advocating on a daily basis. And I think that has led to her kind of stepping back and being out of the public limelight a little bit.
And the other thing which we touched upon was the lack of grand juries that have been called by Melissa Nelson's office to look into a lot of these things like JEA, which we've talked about, and a number of other really high-profile cases.
It's also true that she hasn't had some of the high-profile cases that really binged Angela Corey when she was in office.
Right.
And so that's not really in her control, but that's something that has kept her maybe off the front page a little bit too.
Yep. Did you guys want to
suspect that this is speculation on my part, but I would suspect one of the reasons she has not handled or had any high profile cases like Angela did is probably because she doesn't want them. I would think that if there were an opportunity, the governor certainly would name Melissa Nelson as a special prosecutor in some case if it was needed. I just don't think she wants to be there.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that question. That's legitimate speculation, and I mean I don't know her well enough to make that call.
To move over to issues that you've polled about, crime was the most important concern of those that were polled, followed by housing costs and improved transportation. Yet we don't see any of the respondents from your polling placing that blame anywhere, particularly not with Sheriff Waters, whose approval rating happens to be higher than any of the preceding individuals that we've already mentioned. That to me, I mean, normally it's the buck stops here kind of mentality where if crime is a problem, you look at the sheriff as the first person who at least should have an influence on that, if not blame, if I can put that.
Yeah. I mean,
it's something that has been, we've seen this throughout our polling back when Rutherford was in office. They've all enjoyed relatively high approval ratings. At the same time, crime is consistently the most important problem, with maybe a couple few exceptions when the economy was at the precipice of disaster. Mm-hmm. And that's something that people like cops, they don't like criminals. And I think it speaks a little bit to the nuance of the underlying crime problem here in Duval County. It's not something that you can simply police your way out of. It's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, I would have loved to have seen, and I don't know if you considered asking this question or put it in another context, but if not the sheriff, where do you place?
That's a great question. Yeah.
Where do you place
something
it?
to look at for sure.
When you going back having paid for polling, when you did the tabs, did you see variations in the different zip codes?
The zip codes are a little small to break down, but certainly we see some racial differences. And so off topic a little bit, we do similar polling for the JSO every 2 years as part of their reaccreditation process. And we have much larger samples so we can look a lot closer. And the support for the sheriff and support for different crime fighting initiatives is often strongest in some of those urban zip codes that maybe have some of the highest crime. It's also true that the people that are perpetrating crimes probably aren't responding to our surveys.
Absolutely.
So the folks that are tend to be the more law-abiding citizen types, and
Pleading for help.
Pleading for help, exactly.
Wow, good point. Mr. Tolbert, you want to follow up with that?
Well, I don't want to follow up with that, but I want to go to another subject.
Sure.
The polls, your polls and the other polls show that two issues, abortion and marijuana use, are wanted by the public. But the Florida lawmakers don't seem to be interested in that. What do you think it will take to get them interested in putting that on the ballot for voters to decide?
Well, I think they're two separate issues. I think I'll take the easier one first, the recreational marijuana one, which has the signatures, and support for that is high.
Yep.
And that's a circumstance where, and I think we've saw that with some of the questions that were asked by the state Supreme Court at the hearing last month. They might be inclined to let that on the ballot. If you remember 2 years ago, a similar ballot measure came through and they declined to allow it on the ballot. They went back, they reworded it, taking comments from the court. And I think this time it's probably going to get through on the ballot. The abortion measure is a little bit different in that they haven't quite gotten the verified signatures as of yet. There's also some question. They've only got for the congressional district requirements. You need to have a certain number of signatures in 14 out of the 28 congressional districts, aside from just the 820,000 signatures themselves. So they have till February 1st to do that. If that happens, then they have to get through the court process too. That, again, is a similar argument by the state attorney general about misleading language and what the word viability means. So I think there's more of an opportunity there for the court to prevent that from getting onto the ballot.
If I can follow up then on that, I mean, obviously, 26 other states have already legalized marijuana for recreational use. Are their constitutions different from ours in a sense that it's easier, more difficult to get something like that passed from a public initiative than it would be here in Florida?
Yeah, very much so. Now, again, you got 50 states,
right.
About half of them don't even allow it. So there's variation there, but most states, a simple majority gets something passed. Here in Florida, it's 60% plus one. Additionally, the approval process going through the state Supreme Court in Florida has become much more difficult, and other states don't even have that process. So there's additional hurdles. Those are also the signature hurdles across congressional districts that are required. The number of signatures that are required is higher here in Florida maybe than in some other places too. So yeah, it makes it more difficult here.
Is it unsafe to assume that our Supreme Court could not strike this down only because they disagreed politically with the measure rather than looking at the language and making sure it conforms to all of the different rules and regulations?
I certainly think there's room for interpretation and defense of a political choice couched in legalese. And if you make an analogy, you might want to look at the appeals court that overturned the congressional district map just the other day.
Yes.
I certainly think some of the legal arguments they used were questionable at best. Now that provides great cover for the state Supreme Court. They don't have to act now, but I certainly think that's a circumstance where maybe policy and outcome drove that.
Yeah, and then you got to look at the makeup of the Supreme Court.
True, which we all know is
right.
made up.
And when it goes back to the interpretation of words, as we saw back here when we heard our own attorney say is and may are the same thing.
Yes.
May shall.
New class in law school.
Just alternative facts. That's
yeah.
It. Go ahead, Mike. Tolbert.
Dr. Bender Hightower and I both have been engaged in an awful lot of political campaigns over the last 50 years.
The directive word there being awful.
Most folks think that polling is all about name recognition and popularity, but there are a lot more reasons that campaigns want to have polling done and the benefit they receive from it. Can you talk about that a little bit? What do campaigns get out of good polling?
So it depends what their goals are, and oftentimes they're varied. One, you want to kind of know where you stand in the race to know what type of campaign you want to run. For example, the presidential primary that's going on right now, if Donald Trump wasn't dominating the field and it was nip and tuck, he'd be at these debates. But because he's blowing him out of the water, he doesn't have to show up. He doesn't show up. So that's one piece. The other piece is issues. What does your constituency base care about? Are there things going on that you're unaware of? Are there issues that heat people up that you can tap into? Knowledge about those types of things. And then also framing. How do you want to position yourself on a given issue? How do you want to position yourself as far as what issues you think are most important? All those things can be done via good, rigorous background polling.
Well, picking up on that.
How about targeting?
Sure, figuring out
targeting.
Absolutely, figuring out who your constituents are, who's on the fence, who's out of reach, and then what you want to do to mobilize your base, maybe demobilize the others, and maybe convince those folks that might be in the middle.
In the past, people always, like Mike said, we've been there doing it, but we always said people hate negative campaigning, yet they go ahead and do it. My question back to you is, having watched this recent mayor's campaign, where, from my opinion, the strategy got lost in the tactics. Did you all pick up on that it had crossed the line this time, that people had picked it? Obviously, it did with the way the vote came out, but it's the first time that I've seen negative campaign come back and hit a backlash. Did you all see that coming?
There was a little bit of that. I also think it's important to not necessarily point to one thing for an election outcome.
Right.
Because there was a lot going on there. And if you look across not only this election, but more recent ones, folks tend to overperform who were media personalities and trusted faces in our living rooms for decades on end. Ken Amaro, and if you look at where she was polling and what Donna was doing, she had a pretty positive view, even on the right. Most people generally thought positively of her, and it's hard to run negative campaigns that aren't at least based in some form of reality, and where you have a kernel of truth that you can then expand upon. That makes life much easier. But there's a lot that was going on. It wasn't just necessarily the obnoxiously negative campaigning.
It didn't help, though.
No, it didn't help.
So why then did Daniel Davis, after spending millions of dollars, come in upside down? How do you attribute that to?
I think you could often ask the same thing about Ron DeSantis, right? He spent, potential hundreds of millions of dollars in his Republican primary, and he's coming in well upside down. And I think sometimes, and this is important to understand, candidates don't connect with their electorate. And being able to do that is exceptionally meaningful, especially at the top of the ticket. Listen, you can get elected if you have the right letter after your name. If it's a D or an R and the district is friendly to you and you're a state legislator or a city council person, as long as you don't do anything really stupid, you can easily get elected. But at the top of the ticket, you're going to get attention and people are going to find out about who you are and what you're about. And if you attempt to be something that isn't genuine, or you struggle to connect with people, that's going to show up and it's going to hinder you. Now, those people can occasionally get elected, but more often than not, in tight races, they're going to lose.
And you know what? That has been pointed out by analysts across the country when it comes to DeSantis, that it just says people don't connect with him. They don't, and it reminds me a little bit, and forgive me for saying this, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Daniel Davis campaign. Daniel Davis, as many years as he was in office and held high positions and everything else, people just didn't feel like they knew him. Certainly not enough to go and support him. And I think that's what's going on with Ron DeSantis outside of Florida. God knows what's going to happen in our state, but outside of Florida, I don't think people see him as being sincere. I don't think they feel that he's the kind of guy you want to invite over to have a beer in your kitchen with, or even go to a Jaguars game with. You'd rather not sit with him. You'd rather sit, with the guy with the long beard who looks like a Viking or something. I don't know.
And if you think back to George W. Bush, and it was, who do I want to have a beer with the Al Gore election? Yep. It's not just that. It's you can be aspirational in people wanting to support you, right? If you think back to Barack Obama, he had a charisma about him, but there was an aspirationalness to Barack Obama that maybe George Bush didn't have. He had kind of a different kind of charisma, and certainly not a Donald Trump, but the man has an immense amount of charisma, and that ability to reach people through a television screen is exceptionally rare.
Look at Ronald Reagan.
Very much so.
I mean, there's the epitome
Well, I mean, Mike Tolbert has talked about this on a lot about the campaign. The likable.
Yeah.
Do you like them?
Yep.
Correct, Mike? I mean, you've seen this in the campaigns that
Absolutely. You got to be liked. You got to be likable. And I think that's very key. I absolutely do. Let me kind of change the subject again one more time. Tell me, what's your relationship? What's your UNF? What's your lab's relationship with the New York Times Sienna College poll?
So a good friend of mine runs the Sienna shop up there, and we often do work with them on the New York Times polling. So New York Times is investing, 7 figures plus in polling this year on battleground states leading up into the election. And we've been involved, if you look back last month when they released that battleground polls that had Joe Biden back 5 points in a lot of those states. We've partnered with Sienna, and our callers are making those calls across the country. So our students and our employees are the ones involved in that. And that's something that I'm proud of, right? We have an AB rating on 538. We're connected to, clearly the most influential newspaper in the country and by extension, probably the world. And I think that's a feather in the cap for the university.
Absolutely. And we appreciate it. When you're talking about the polling and Florida being one of the fastest growing states, South Florida, progressive, more liberal, up here, more conservative, though in the last election, difference like that. Do you see the change in your students and their attitudes about that
I think our students have always been much more mixed than you might expect. The narrative about college students being these lefty hippies was never anything that really existed at UNF. And in fact, most schools that I've been at, it's just not a real reflection of reality. And our students, the overwhelming vast majority of they work 40 plus hours a week. Mm-hmm. They're oftentimes not from the upper crust. They tend to be more blue collar, often first time in college students, Pell Grant recipients. It's a very diverse group, and they tend to not be from the higher socioeconomic statuses. And with that, you get a very different type of student, and I think a much better classroom for diversified discussion.
With the number of people who are moving into Florida, and I saw that, I think there was something in the paper today, as a matter of fact, about that as far as where people are coming from and where they're going to. Are we starting to see any kind of a wave that's starting to come over Florida? Because as Hightower just said, you're right. And South Florida is progressive. North Florida is generally, conservative. And then there's the I-4 corridor, which determines every election in Florida state, at least it used to. But is that changing? Are you finding that changing and how?
It's wildly different than it used to be. And I make those attributions to our immigrants. And I don't necessarily mean immigrants from Central America. I mean immigrants from Michigan and Pennsylvania and New York State. They're still the same old white people. It's just that those old white people right now tend to be much more conservative than they used to be. If you think back, listen, Florida has been a haven for retirees from the Northeast for 50 years. And so,
except he's still not retired. Don't let him kid you.
Right. But if you think back even to Seinfeld when they were trying to move to Boca Raton, right? But those retirees, often they were union folks. They were middle class working folks that had ties to the Democratic Party. That isn't the case anymore. Most of our senior type folks tend to lean much more Republican, and they are coming here in droves, and that's really shifting the makeup. And if you look at the registration in Florida, we used to be a +2, +3D. We're +3 and growing Republican.
Exactly.
I mean, there's no chance a Democrat's going to win statewide in the foreseeable future.
And the other thing, which I should be able to report this. It was either the Business Journal or one of them said the number. Let me put this: is that they are seeing a wave of people from South Florida moving into North Florida or Central Florida or West Florida. One, prices, home
affordability.
I was one of them. One of them.
Yeah, but I mean that's happening and it's changing.
But also the growth here and I say Duval, but really the Northeast Florida area has changed, right? St. John was always the place that's growing,
right?
But now that's Clay.
Oh.
And after Clay, it's going to be Nassau, right? And so that's important to understand that we're growing on the outskirts in those suburbs and those exurbs. That's really where growth is happening in Florida.
But again, let me go back to where people are coming from, because maybe I was under the misconception that as I saw California being number one and New York and New Jersey being 2 and 3 or somewhere in that area, I'm sitting here and thinking, my gosh, those are bastions of Democrat Party candidates. Does that mean that's going to be influencing our politics going forward, where all of these Californians are coming in? Now, I don't know if they're all coming from San Francisco, or any strong Democratic strongholds, but California, well, look at Newsom's their governor. He's a Democrat.
Sure, but again, they're not all. It's who's coming.
It's who's
right?
coming.
It's who's coming. And if you think about New Jersey and New York, I'm a Jersey native and I still go up there, so I'm familiar, right? Those folks are the older retiree folks, but also post-COVID and the move to remote work, people that are able to work remotely now can do that here in Florida. They don't necessarily have to live in New York City. And with that, think about the jobs that have that. They tend to be more white collar, tend to be more higher end. That tends to lead into maybe some more of the traditional Republican type voters. Maybe now there's maybe some high end Democrat voters with college degrees and those sorts of things. But those are the types of people that are coming here. It's not just the old white folks.
Plus, Florida it's a tax haven. When you look at it, so you bring people in from New Jersey or New York or something like that. We talked about this once before when they brought Deutsche Bank came in here, and those people moved from Manhattan down here. They thought they had died and gone to heaven. And I would think my assumption is you bring those people here, it's a different quality of life, and you live in a neighborhood and you get to know your neighbors. And if they are more conservative, you tend to want to be part of the neighborhood. So you're going to go along with that. That's my assumption.
I'm sure there's some of that, but it's true, right? As you bring people in now, that the cost of living is changing, particularly over the last few years. We are not the dirt poor backwater that maybe we used to be, particularly if you look at some housing costs around here. But it's not Manhattan, right? It's not urban LA.
Yeah, it's.
Can I ask a question about the polling process?
Yeah. Yes,
that's where I was going. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Bender, do you folks do all your polling by phone, or do you use other methods as well?
We use a variety of different methods. Phone, I still think, is probably the best under most circumstances. It's also exceptionally expensive and time consuming. We do text messaging. We do emails. It depends on what the method is. We've done mail. You really need to figure out what your population is and how you can best match that population with your sample. And whichever method that happens to be, that's what we try to balance. But you're always balancing cost and resources as well.
Following up on Mike, talking about Dr. Bender, what you're doing, and what you're doing is fantastic. I just think that I don't think enough people know the good work you're doing. When you say we are doing this, who's we? And do you have UNF students who are going into this? Can you talk about who the we is?
So the we, right?
Who the we?
Right. I'm the guy that's out here doing the podcast and on the local news, but I have an associate director, Andrew Hopkins. I have a research coordinator, Eva Matthews. I have an HR coordinator, Joe Hyder. We have a team of people coordinating this, and our interviewers are overwhelmingly students. They're on the payroll, right? We're not slave labor here. And they have a great opportunity to work as interviewers, work their way up to supervisors. Maybe we have a lead supervisor, Rachel. Rachel McDonald. She's on our team. She's a former undergrad, now in grad school. It's a team organization, and it's an opportunity for everybody to collaborate and get us in the right direction. And I think that helps.
So do you see this as a field that's expanding?
I think it's a field that's expanding nationally. I also think it's a field that's tightening within the university circles. Many universities are shutting down their polls.
Really?
Yeah. And part of that's because universities don't always like some of the political blowback, particularly if you're doing election polling. Somebody's going to be losing that poll, and they're going to be angry, or somebody's not going to be on that poll because they're a fringe candidate, and then all their supporters are going to call up the university PR people and yell at them. So there's a lot of potential negatives that some universities are adverse to.
Let me bring it. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just want to go, which sort of underscores, Dr. Bender, what you're doing and what your team is doing, or what the team is doing, is then the credibility and the integrity in which you're doing it. That's that firewall that gives why people continue to listen to you or ask you to do it.
We hope so. We hope for that credibility, and because of that, we don't do work with parties. We do work with
Good.
entities. We've partnered with news stations and newspapers, and you talked about Pantazzi, and I've worked with him in the past, and,
Right.
and entities like that. But we stay away from the active political aspects of it.
Yeah.
And I was going to take this full circle and go all the way back to our first talk, which was the removal of elected officials. Is there concern that if you step on some toes when you're doing polling, that could also cause some kind of a, major blowback from Tallahassee, whoever happens to be in office, to say, wait a minute here.
Good.
They should not be doing this kind of. All of a sudden, you guys have become woke.
Yeah.
And I mean, and you're in trouble.
And that's real, and that's a concern, and that's always something that people have to think about. But I'm a tenured professor, and I know tenure's been under fire here at the University of North, and not only in University of North Florida, but here in Florida writ large. I'll be fine if it's okay. I really care much more about doing the right thing and giving people an opportunity to have their voice heard.
Which really goes back to credibility, integrity, reputation. People don't like to hear bad news. Tough, but
You got a final question, Mr. Tolbert?
yeah.
I always ask him.
Well, I've got two. One is, Dr. Bender, have you guys experienced what you were just talking about? Have you experienced that kind of blowback and criticism? And if so, how do you handle it?
We've gotten some phone calls, and I think back when I was first there, when Mayor Brown was in office, and I got a phone call from now a friend of mine, Chris Hand, about some of the polling that we had been doing, and we've asked some questions about JEA at the height of everything that was going on. And we got some phone calls about that, and so these things happen, and luckily our administration has been okay with it and understanding of it, and understand that the benefit of us being out there and providing these opportunities for our students and providing the opportunity for name recognition for the university has outweighed any of those. But they have come on occasion.
I know we can't see into November of next year, but I'll also go back to this. Mike had brought up the issue of abortion. We haven't talked about that yet, but I'm just wondering, with the overwhelming support that you have found in your polling, both for a constitutional amendment that would guarantee the right to abortion and a constitutional amendment that would finally legalize recreational marijuana, how much impact do you think that's going to have on the election itself? Is that going to bring out enough people where all of a sudden we may become a little more purple than we have been red?
And this is, my dissertation topic is related to this a little bit as well.
Glad I could help.
Oh,
But and the
insight there.
Right. The short answer is that for a presidential election, not really. And what happens is all the folks that tend to be marginal voters, right? There's people that are never going to vote, and there's people that always vote. Right. But the marginal voters, they tend to come out for those presidential elections anyway. It's the midterm elections. It's those weird city council elections in March and May where there's room to mobilize people to vote, and those issues can do it. Listen, are you going to be able to point to somebody's grandkid who's 19 years old, who's never voted, who's only voting to vote for marijuana? Sure, absolutely. But if you want to talk about, a percentage point increase in turnout, it's probably not going to happen in a general election.
But we have seen it in the abortion question in other states.
Yes, in other states, in these weird off-year elections.
Right.
And that's when it's been happening. And that's when it can definitely make an impact.
Okay. Guys, we're running out of time. You have something else, Mr. Hightower, you
No,
want to throw out?
I think the one thing that is, I think we are very fortunate to have Dr. Binder and his team.
Yep.
Really, seriously, Mike, having y'all here, having done this, as Mike Tolbert said, we've been doing it a long time. Pollsters, call themselves pollsters, they come and go. But I can tell you, the ones that don't do a good job, it impacts the system. It impacts outcomes, and it also turns people off. So,
And it impacts the reputation of the people that are trying to do it right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm going to tell you, one, thanks for the job you're doing, and kudos to your team. Mike Tolbert, what you got to say last?
Yeah, I've got a final question, if you don't mind, and I will tell you, Doctor, that I've worked with some really outstanding pollsters, and I love pollsters, frankly. I find them with integrity. I find them knowledgeable, reliable, and I just get energy from working with good pollsters and have for years. But my final question is, what's next? What's next for the lab? Well, what's on your polling agenda?
Well, we're actually, you brought up Sienna. We're going into the field on Sunday for another project with Sienna for about a week or so. Then we're going to kind of ease off for over the Christmas holidays, and we're going to get back to it in January. And we'll probably be doing another local survey about Jacksonville in the spring, probably in the February range, and tackling a bunch of issues, the jail and the stadium and whatever else happens to pop up on the calendar in between now and then.
Well, let us know when it's coming out, because then we need to book you back on the show to do that.
I was going to do that. I want to ask a follow-up question because of Mike. In the past, what happens in Northeast Florida has always sort of been a highlight in national elections. Do you see Northeast Florida being one of the places they're going to spotlight?
I do not. I see Florida as Ohio. We used to be a very fascinating, competitive battleground state. We are now a red state.
Really?
Yep.
Wow.
It's going to be an interesting primary with two Floridians that are going to be running, if both of them are still in the race by the time we get to.
You want to do some betting right now?
I think I've already done that publicly, but nevertheless, we'll see what happens.
Mr. Tolbert, we're going to give you the last word.
Goodbye.
Thank you, sir.
Always profound. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Mike.
Mike's, it's been great to be here.
Thank you. We love talking politics. And
yeah, we're going to have you back.
Appreciate you very much.
Listen, anytime I can be in a room with 3 other Mikes, sign me up.
Well, we hope to have you often. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
I have a suggestion. Can we just replace Hightower with this mic?
Hey, wait a minute.
Check, please. I think we've stayed in this restaurant just a little too long.
Okay, let me bring the pictures out on Tolbert. Okay, we're going to play this.
This
game.
really devolved.
Go back to your shovel, will you, please? Thank you, Mike. It's good to see you. Thank you, everybody,
fellas.
for joining us. We'll see you again next week, and have a good week.
Y'all take care. Thanks.
Mike's on Mike with Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and Mike Miller can be found at your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook and YouTube. Learn more at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversations with Mike's on Mike.